We have a inventory that can display things, but it is not yet interactable, and that's kind of necessary for a useful inventory. So let's today look at simple drag and drop operations to move items around and swap item slots. And then in the next video we'll look more into the advanced stuff like merging and splitting item stacks like you would do in a game like Minecraft. For now, let's get into this. So we've got our inventory split up into a slot, a grid, and then an actual display. We're going to be doing all of our coding here in the inventory slot. Let's go into the graph here, and we're going to go into the functions, and we'll override a few of these functions. The first that we're going to override is on preview mouse button down. This is an alternative way to detect mouse button down that doesn't have like a callback. And that's useful for what we're going to be doing here with it today, because we're going to be using that for a drag and drop operation. For now, this is going to be relatively easy, but we're going to build this out a little bit in the next part as well. And here we simply want to check if the mouse event is mouse button down. And then we're going to check the mouse button. You can just click on this little keyboard value and then click on the left mouse button, and it will automatically populate this with the left mouse button. Now, this is a little bit annoying because this does make it specifically a mouse and keyboard related thing, so any controller might have some more trouble with this. We're just going to be doing this setup easily with just the left mouse button for the time being, because otherwise all of this is going to end up being very, very chaotic. So when we have seen that this is indeed the left mouse button, or whatever key we are mapping to this, if you're using the enhanced subsystem, at that point, we're going to say, hey, we want to start a drag operation. And the key that we're going to be dragging will be, in this case, the left mouse button. And that will also give us a event structure here that we can use as the return value. Running this node is going to start off a second separate function on here. And that is going to be the on drag detected. So this will start a drag and drop operation, which we'll get into in a minute how that works. And when a drag and drop operation starts, this event will fire. And that will have the pointer event, which is whatever we put into here. And we also actually need to connect the mouse event up to the pointer event, and that's just going to pass it through to the drag and drop operation. Now, in here, we want to check, just for future reference reasons, whether or not we are pressing the left mouse button or dragging the left mouse button rather, because in future we're also going to be checking whether or not it is the right mouse button, because we're going to be splitting stacks with the right. So we might as well implement that now. And we're going to be cutting in here real quick. I mixed two things up, and what you want to do, first things first here, on drag selected, you can ignore everything to the right side, we'll do that in a moment. You want to check again, is mouse button down? And we're going to go for the left mouse button in this case, doing that into a branching node. Now, let's go back to building out the rest of the system that you see on the right hand side here. Now, we're going to pause this here for the time being, because what we're going to do when we are dragging something, we want to have a little preview window of the item that we're dragging around. So we need to make that little preview window. And it's actually quite easy, because we're just going to copy over the item slot, just duplicate it with Ctrl and D, and we'll call this WBP item drag preview. And this will very easily just be kind of more or less the exact same thing. Don't mind my scroll wheel being a little weird. Except we're going to remove the border, because we don't want to be dragging around the border. That would look weird. And in the icon, we're going to come up here to the tint. And I want to set the tint for this to be a alpha of about 0.5. So it's a little bit see-through. That way it's clear that it is a preview image. Still want to display the number and everything together with that. So in the graph, all of this we actually want to keep. But we can get rid of all the override functions that we literally just made, because we're not going to be needing those. And that is how we make the drag preview. It's just that easy. And the reason that we need to make that is because we're going to be needing to add that here. So we can create a widget. Again, back in our item slots in our on drag detected function. And there we can make our drag preview. We want to give that the inventory slot that we are working with right here. And since we're just going to be dragging around the entire inventory slot for now, we can take the inventory slot structure that we have on the item slot itself and just put that in there. And that's going to just make a kind of a ghost copy of the inventory slot that we're dragging from. Now we need to create a drag and drop operation. And for that, we need to make a class, but I'll add the node first. So we can create a drag and drop operation. In this, we're going to need to put in a drag and drop class. It has a default one, but that's not really going to do for what we need it for in the future. So we might as well jump in right away and create that. I'm going to create it in the inventory screen here because it's UI related. Coming up to blueprint class, we can just type in drag. And that will allow us to make a drag drop operation. So let's call this DDO for drag drop operation. Drag in slots, something simple like that. And here we can put in some information on stuff we want to pass through. So what we want to pass through is a couple of important things. We want to start working with indexes now. Specifically, if we're going to be moving things from one inventory to another in the future, if we're going to be worrying about splitting and merging stacks, we want to have a reference to what the original index was where we got things from in case we need to return items to that slot. And in the same way, we also need to have a reference to the original inventory component that this thing came from, because it is very possible that we're going to be moving things from one inventory component into another. And again, if something fails, we want to be able to return the items where they came from. So let's make that inventory component. Let's actually call it source inventory component to make sure we know what we're talking about. So source invcomp, and we'll make that a inventory component reference. And then we'll also say our source index will just literally be a integer. And both of these are going to be instance editable, and they're going to also be exposed on spawn, which is quite relevant because we're going to be setting them right away as these things spawn in. And while we're at it, actually, what I'm going to do is I also want to change things around a little bit so that the inventory slots themselves have a concept of a index, and you'll see why in a second. Because we have our drag and drop operation now, we can set it to our custom one, and that will allow us to put in an inventory component and a source index. Now, we need a value for both of those. And the source index, the easiest way to facilitate that is to just give our inventory slots an index. So let's go find where we created that blueprint structure for that. That is right over here. And let's just add the variable for the index on it. You could also put this on the widget blueprint if you preferred. I like doing this because it's easier to move information around with this. And you will see why in a second. Because now we have this inventory slot and we can just simply say break that open and we have the index. And we can immediately put that in there. That said, we are not setting the index value anywhere. And in order to set this index, we're going to need to come back into our inventory component here, because we have that function inventory constructor, if you remember, which just adds our inventory slots. But now what we actually want to do is we want to give all of them a value for their index, at least. So what we're going to do is we will, when we add the slots to the inventory, we'll still have them at has item none and stack size 0 and item asset being nothing. But we're going to hook up the index from our for loop into the index here. So every single one of the slots on our array will have a number that references their index. Even when we're taking something out of the array and then doing something with it, we will still have that information on where in the array it might have to return to at some point in the future, which is just good information to have. So that sets up our source index. We needed a little couple changes there to make things work. But now for the source inventory components. There's, again, a couple of ways we can do this. I just want to add a inventory component reference to every item slot. So let's make this the inventory components. and we'll make that, of course, of type inventory component object reference. And we're going to set this to instance editable, obviously, and expose on spawn as well. Then coming over into our item grid, where the item slots get spawned in, we can refresh this node here, and that will now have inventory components as a new bin. Our item grid itself already had a reference to the inventory component, so we can very simply just pull that through, and now whatever this is getting set to, all of these slots also now have a direct reference to that same inventory component, which is very, very nice. And with that, we can simply hook that up into here, and now our drag and drop operation will be able to access that information as well. And from there, we can simply hook this up into the return node. The drag and drop operation that we've just made will be our return value. And the widget that we have just created for the drag and drop preview is going to go into the default drag visual. So what this will do is it'll make the temporary inventory preview visual, and it's just going to put that at the location of your mouse cursor. You can even create a bit of offset to it if you want to, or set the pivot to somewhere else. For the time being, we're not going to bother with that. And now you'll be able to see, we still can't actually do anything with it, because when we open up this widget, we don't actually have our cursor and we can't interact with it. So in order for that to be fixed, let's go into our third-person blueprint here. And we're going to be changing a couple of things around with the way our item update here works as well, but not for right now. What we're going to be doing for right now is when we open up the inventory here, we want to show the mouse cursor and make our widget interactable. And for that, we're going to need to get the player controller. And when we have the player controller, we can set show mouse cursor, which is just a bool that shows mouse cursor or not. So when we do show the widget, we want to, of course, show our mouse cursor. And then when we disable the widget again, we want to not be showing our mouse cursor. And do make sure that you are hooking up the player controller to it. One more step is needed, because we also need to set our input mode. We're going to set input mode to game and UI in this case. You could also do UI only, but that would not work too well with the way I make the UI visible and invisible right now. This event will no longer run if the input mode is set to UI only, because this is a game input, not a UI input. So if you do that, you need to make something on your UI to close out of your inventory again, rather than allowing it to be key-based. So for now, we're just going to do it this way, because that's the easiest way. We want to set the widget in focus to be our inventory UI widget. And we don't want to hide our cursor during capturing. When we remove the widget again, what we want to do is we want to set input mode to game only. It is not really an issue, usually, if it also still is able to interact with UI, but if you've got other UI elements, that might mess you up in some way, so just set it back to game only to be sure. And now you'll be able to see if we pick up this sword and we drag and drop this around, we can see we have this preview. Of course, it doesn't really do anything yet, because obviously for that we need to program in functionality, but we've got a good start going. Luckily from here it's actually relatively simple. So let's open up our inventory component again, and we're going to make a new function in that, and we're just going to swap slots. This function will take in two parameters, which will both be simple indexes. So we'll say index source and the index destination. And both of those will, of course, be integers because they're going to be indexes. And I mistyped. I typed spawn slots. It will be swap slots. We'll come back later to this and allow this to then also swap slots between different inventories, like if you have a chest and you want to swap things around. For now, this is only going to work within the one inventory, just to keep things a little bit simpler. And what we're going to do here is we'll get our inventory array, and there we will just get a copy of both of those indexes. So we'll just get copy from both the index source and the index destination, and then we're going to save those inventory slots with all of their data temporarily. And the way we do that is we right click this and we can promote to a local variable. The difference between a local variable and a normal variable, we'll call this, let's see, source stack. And we'll do the same for this one, which will be our target stack. The difference between a normal variable and a local variable, if you are wondering, because I don't think I've covered that yet in many of my videos, is these exist as long as the object exists, in this case the inventory component. So this is just going to always exist, and once we set a value on this, it's going to keep that value, and we can always refer to that. Local variables only exist within the context of a specific function. So if I go into my inventory constructor function and you keep your eye on the local variables here, they will disappear because those variables only exist to this function. And when this function is done with running, it's going to discard the values and the memory allocated to keep those values around. So for optimization, it's good to, when you can put something as a local variable, to do that, because you're going to be saving a bit of memory. But it's also quite useful because if you ever refer back to this and you run the function again, it's going to start the function with those variables being empty. And that's exactly what we want here, because we're just using them to store the information of those two slots. We'll get our inventory array again, and we'll set the array elements, and we're just going to swap these around. So the reason that we're saving these, by the way, is if we set one of the inventory slots to be the contents of the other inventory slot, then we don't have the information on the other inventory slots anymore. This way, they get saved to something separately, and then we can safely swap things around. So we want to set the index source to whatever the target stack was, and then we want to set the target index or the destination index or whatever to whatever the source stack was to begin with. Now, for swapping these items, there's also a bit of an issue with the swapping around of the indexes, and we can be very bothersome and fix that up in here. But what we can also do is in the item grid, every time we make this new item slot, instead of just passing through the array element as a whole, what we can do is we can split this structure pin, and we can break the inventory structure and just pass through everything except the index, and the index will just be the thing that we take from the for each loop. This way, everything still gets an index on setup with the for loop that we did earlier in the video. But whenever we change something about the inventory, the index for the inventory slot structure also properly gets updated to whatever new slot everything is in. And now that we've updated that, we're going to need to update the visuals for the UI again. And in order to do that, we could make a inventory UI reference in here and populate that and then just run that function directly every single time. What we're going to do instead is we're going to make a event dispatcher, and we'll call this on inventory changed. And this is simply going to call out whenever we run something that is going to change the inventory. So just to be thorough, we're also going to go back into our add item here. And at the end of our paths here, so before the return nodes, we're going to put in the inventory change as well. Because as you remember at the end of the last video, what I said about the way we're updating the inventory visuals right now is we're just doing it on interaction. But what if we are dragging things from one inventory into another? That doesn't involve our interaction system. And what if we're interacting with something that's not inventory? Then we don't need to update the inventory. So this way, we'll just link the update inventory to whenever inventory gets changed. And while we're at it, again, might as well also do this for the remove item. So we drag this in, we call, and whenever an item gets removed, we also want to update our inventory visuals. And the way we do that is coming into our item grid. We have a reference to our inventory component. On construct, what we're going to do is we're going to bind event to on inventory changed. So that's this one here. That's going to make us this node with a little red pin in here, and this will be able to be connected to custom events. So we can hook it up to that if we want to. What I prefer doing is just simply making a custom event that runs that other event. That way, if we want to add other things to on inventory changed, which maybe themselves don't have anything to do with updating the item grid for whatever reason. It's just a little bit cleaner. So update inventory delegates or event dispatcher. They're called delegates in C++. And that will then just run the update item grid. We're running into a bit of an issue here that you might have also run into if you're playing ahead a little bit, and that is that this inventory component doesn't have a value yet on event construct for this widget. It only gets set moments after it is constructed, but by that time this is already run and failed and we're not binding anything at all, which is a little bit annoying. There's a lot of reworking that we can do to make this work a little bit better. Honestly, it's a little bothersome to deal with in general, so I'm going to show you a little bit of a hacky way to get around this, and that is because we're fairly confident that it's only going to take like one tick, one frame of processing before this thing has a value and will just straight up work. So if we simply put in a delay node here, and we can set that to like a very low number, like 0.1 seconds. You can even go lower if you want to, like you can set this to 100th of a second, which will just wait one tick. I like to play a little bit more safe though, and go for 0.1 seconds. That will event construct, then wait for about 1/10 of a second, at which point this value is now populated and this will work. Even on very slow systems, it's a very simple thing that we're loading in. It's not going to take more than 1/10 of a second. This will be fine. It's a little bit of a hacky way to do things, but it works, and that is the most important part. So now that we have all that in place, let's go over that real quick again, because we just did a lot. We updated our on inventory change. And with that, we can come up here to our interaction system and remove the update item grid from that in our third person character, because we no longer need that. Now, we did a lot of things very quickly there, so let's real quick go back over them just as a recap. Our inventory component now has a couple of changes with this event dispatcher that we added to everything that is changing the inventory directly. We also added this swap slots thing that gets the two slots that are being swapped around. It's going to save them to a safe and separate location, and then it's going to set those two slots to the value of the other slot. And then of course call the on inventory change, which whenever that is called in the item grid, it will run the update item grid function that we've made before, so it reflects our changes. So now let's check whether or not that works. Let's pick up this sword, open up our inventory, do our drag and drop. Now this starts our drag and drop very, very well. The only issue is that we now need to add in the dropping part of the drag and drop, and that itself on the item slot again is an overridable function, so we can just on drop. This has the operation, which is the output from our return node here. And it also has the pointer event, which at this point we are used to. For the operation, we need to cast this to our drag drop operation drag inventory slot, because this is a generic drag and drop operation. And we'll check our inventory components, and we will want to swap slots for two things, and that's our source and our destination. And we can get our source index because we passed that through into our drag and drop operation before. And our destination index is just going to be the index of our current inventory slot. So we get our inventory slot structure, we break that, we get the index out of it, and that's now simply going to swap any two slots that we are dragging and dropping between. So this part of it is really quite easy. And now you'll see, if I pick up the sword, and I pick up a couple of rocks which are bouncing all over the place, you'll be able to see that I can swap these into different places very easily. And if I drag it onto a existing item slot, it swaps those two around. And realistically, even when I'm doing this, it's still swapping the slots around, but when I'm swapping something with an empty slot, it just looks like I move from one slot into the other. So now we have the capability to organize our inventory a little bit better. Next time we'll be taking the next step into also allowing us to split our stacks. So if we have, for instance, 8 items here and we want to take half of them and put them into a different slot, we'll be able to. Things get a lot more complicated very quickly with that, but I do think that is important to have as an option in your inventory system. And for the full course, if you're watching this in the future, it should be all up on the YouTube channel already. But if you're watching this shortly after it was uploaded, there will be a link down below in the description to the Patreon where you can find the full course, plus a little bonus episode where we go over and change some things to make some alternative ways to interact with the inventory, which will be a Patreon exclusive episode. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page. And a special thanks to my Cave Digger tier Patreons, Sir J. Thomas,